Longtime member of the League of Women Voters. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Danielle Barreca with the Napa County Historical Society Board of Directors. Thank you for tuning in today. It is because of the support of members like you that we are able to still provide content during this challenging time. Please consider renewing your membership or gifting a membership to a friend or family member. Thank you, and we hope you tune in again.
Most of all, I just really want to thank everybody for being here this evening. Welcome. This is very exciting to co-host such a special event with the League of Women Voters and the Napa County Historical Society. In the next hour, we will pay homage to women's suffrage, the 100th year anniversary of the League of Women Voters and the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, ratified August 18, 1920. I'm thrilled to introduce our guest speakers. First, Vita Flores, President of the League of Women Voters, Napa County. Her presentation titled, Looking Back, Moving Forward, is in honor of the League's centennial anniversary and the Napa League's history, including how we arrived to this evening's event. Next, Dr. Shelley O. Smith, member of the Napa County Historical Society Board of Directors. Shelley has recently spent her time researching through Joe Calizzo's special collection to unearth the history of Juliana Pope, finding great interest in her ancestry and how Juliana used property laws through marriage to her advantage during pioneer times in Pope Valley. And our keynote speakers this evening, Susie and Steve Swat, authors of Paving the Way, Women's Struggle of Political Equality in California. Published last year by the Institute of Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley, it tells the backstories of remarkable women who left their marks along the elusive trail to political gender equality in California. Now, please feel free to submit your questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Towards the end of this evening, we'll have a dynamic Q&A session facilitated by Vita Flores. Now, please welcome Vita Flores.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming, spending your Friday night with us. I'm going to share a few PowerPoint slides. And here we can go ahead and get started. Can everyone see my screen? Okay. So the League of Women Voters just recently turned 100. So on February 14th. And my journey with the Historical Society began in the fall of last year when we heard that the Historical Society housed elements from the League of Women Voters back to the 1940s. So as you can see behind me, this is the anniversary year, and you'll see our purple and gold flag. And in the image on the screen, you'll see the banner. It's purple and gold banner. So representing 100 years of the League of Women Voters. This is also a special year for the Napa League of Women Voters, as the new reinvented league is turning 5 years old. So we were having a historical celebration anniversary party on February the 15th, and we needed a few items. So I took a drive over to the Historical Society and found this wonderful box of elements. So you can see it's very carefully curated, and inside there were years and years of our monthly voter newsletters. So when we talk about our journey moving forward and looking back, here we are in the midst of the voters. And remember, back then, these were printed, mimeographed, and the Historical Society has a stack of them about this thick. So the League of Women Voters likes to take notes and put it down on paper, and we're really looking forward to looking into it, and we're at the point of discovery. So we found what we need, and we found some beautiful images from the 1960s. And here's Grania, I think. Is that you, Grania? So we see elements of Grania. And one of my favorite things to look at on our journey of discovery was the handwritten notes. And one of the exciting things is now we have a legacy. So as you can see here on the bottom left, it says get out to vote, and circling around to the top left, candidate nights. And one of the things that the League of Women Voters has continuity from the early years until now. We're still doing the same things. We're still writing letters to the legislators, and we're still out in the public. So it's very exciting for us to find the handwritten material. And the very last voter indicated that they didn't know what was going to happen with the league. So we took over 20-year absence in the Napa Valley, and they were talking about, can you ever think of a time in the Napa Valley where we didn't have a League of Women Voters? So that being said, we were absent for that 20-year period, and now we've reinvented ourselves. And through our work with the Historical Society, we're able to create that legacy and continue our research. And one element is, as I mentioned, the League likes to take a lot of notes, is it's time for us to look through all of these documents. And one of the things that we discovered is we have a position. And a position is very important to the League of Women Voters. A position is an area of study, such as housing or transportation. And so we study and look into information and find out where we are and come up with a position on housing, transportation, water. And what we found currently, the new league has no positions. We haven't taken any time to do our studies. We've been building our organization back, but we found in one of the newsletters that there is a position. We don't know what it is. We don't know how it reads. And we're in the state of discovery, trying to look through all of these documents to find out what our legacy is. So that's why I'm thrilled to work with Nicole in this beautiful space. And the documents are well organized, and it's a great place for us to continue. So that's just the highlights of our journey with the League of Women Voters. And through the information we found, we were able to write a story about the League, and it was just published in last month's Tidings. So thank you very much for sharing our story from the information that we got from you. Okay. I'll stop sharing now, and back to you, Liz.
Okay, can we hear me now? As they say. Thank you, Vita. That was really interesting and very fascinating, and it's been a wonderful partnership working with you. And really, I did introduce early on Nicole Riggs. Nicole is our research librarian and recent graduate of her master's degree. So let's all applaud Nicole for this great accomplishment. I mean, it really is a lifetime achievement. Could not be more proud of her. And she did that in addition to being our librarian, and she's pretty amazing. So thank you, Nicole, for everything that you do. Now for Dr. Shelley O. Smith, and she has found really of this fascinating history, Juliana Pope. So Shelley, would you like to begin?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's exciting to share the rich archives of the Historical Society. You know, history is always a collection of facts woven into a story, and it comes from many, many different people, and they have different lenses. And American history has always been told really primarily by men who are of European descent and lived on the Eastern Seaboard. So California's history often is a bit sketchy. And so it's very important, I think, that we get in there and tell these stories. And when I got asked to do this, this is a very small piece of the Juliana Pope story, but I think it's a very important piece. In early women's rights, there's often, women are often just relegated to facts and events. But the women of the time, it was a lot more complex than that. Juliana Pope is one of the earliest women settlers in the Napa Valley. And she's a really good example of how women gained and used the increasing rights of the mid-19th century, but also paradoxically, how she used her cultural norms to create protection around her and her family. Juliana was born Maria Juliana Salazar in 1810 in New Mexico, which was then a territory of colonial Spain. Spanish women could own property in their own name. They could act as witnesses in a court. They could bring litigation against other people. And this is amply recorded in the New Mexico records that we found. These freedoms, though, and rights were tempered by the pervasive cultural belief that women were the weaker vessel and they needed to be protected either by a father or a husband. So Juliana's story, of course, then is this excellent example of this mixture of cultural norms of her needing to be protected, as well as exercising her rights. In 1826, by the time Juliana was of marrying age, Mexico had seceded from Spain. However, women's rights, as it were, that were afforded under Spanish rule were kept in the new nation's laws. And so Juliana not only grew up with the understanding she could own property, but she also was a young woman in Mexican citizenship, and she knew she could do this as well. Yet the cultural perception of protection had Juliana married by the time she was 15 and married twice by the time she was 17, when she began living with Julian Pope, who was an immigrant from Kentucky who moved to New Mexico in 1821. And although Pope became a Mexican citizen in 1826, the Catholic Church accused Pope of marrying Juliana in 1834 so he could get citizenship. And they made their case against the popes using the weaker vessel argument. That basically, in short, Juliana had been seduced by Julian Pope, didn't know what she was really doing, and he was able to utilize her citizenship to get his. Juliana would not accept this, and Julian Pope was jailed for what the church accused him of. But Juliana petitioned the courts, and she petitioned the church, and she took it to court, and she stood by her husband, and in the end, she won her case, and their marriage was left intact. The popes then moved to California, and in 1838, they got their first land grant near the Mission San Gabriel in Los Angeles. And then in 1841, through the urgings of George Yount, they moved to Northern California and established a land grant in a small valley next to the larger Napa Valley, which now bears their name, Pope Valley. In 1843, Julian Pope suffered a fatal accident, and leaving a wife and 5 children. Juliana immediately petitioned the Mexican government, and she petitioned to be allowed to be the trustee of the land grant in her own name, and that she would keep this in trust for her children, the Pope children. At the same time, George Yount pressured Juliana to marry a man named Elias Barnett, and pressured Juliana to marry off her eldest daughter, Maria, to a man named Ralph Kilburn. Both of these men are pioneers in the Napa Valley. Both of the men were the same age as Juliana's husband, who was 5 years older than Juliana. And neither of them had Mexican citizenship. And in the 1840s, Mexican citizenship was extremely important for land ownership. So Juliana had a card. She owned land. She owned 9,000 acres. And these men needed citizenship. So Juliana married Barnett. Maria married Ralph Kilburn. But Juliana never shared her rights to Lo Coleami, which was the rancho, the Pope family rancho. She neither shared her ownership with her husband, nor did she share it with any of the children that were born from the Barnett marriage. She only shared it with the Pope children. Barnett got Mexican citizenship, and Juliana got to successfully run the rancho for the next decade. So she ran the rancho in her own name, bartered with it, sold cows, cattle, and horses to the Mexican government, and then to the American government for the next decade. well, Barnett went off to the Bear Flag Revolt, and then he also went off to prospect in the gold rush. So Barnett was off wandering. Juliana was back at the ranch. When California entered into the United States, Juliana became an American citizen. And the rights that she had known growing up as first a Spanish citizen and then a Mexican citizen were in jeopardy. Because women could not trade in their own right in the United States at that time. But California in 1852 passed a law where women could trade and have a business in their own name. And so Juliana immediately petitioned the California State Lands Commission and the US federal government for recognition of the Mexican land grant. But there was a loophole in this law, and California allowed land to be traded while it was still being considered for its validity of the land grant. And so in 1854, Juliana sold half of the rancho to her eldest son, Jose Pope, and then she divided the other half of the rancho among her 4 Pope daughters as dowries. And the Pope children got this land, and they kept it until the California government in 1856 validated that the rancho was truly the Pope family's land and that they had clear title to it. But Juliana obviously had never quite been happy in the last of her marriages to Elias Barnett, go figure. And anyway, so she, as soon as she sold off the rancho to her children, she left town. She left her husband and all the children that they had, the 6 children they had in that marriage. And she went back down to Southern California to live where she had lived originally when they first came to California. So what you have here is a woman who over the course of her 90 years of life had been a Spanish citizen, a Mexican citizen, and an American citizen. She exercised her legal rights to protect her marriage, secure valuable land rights, and to manage a prosperous rancho. She also manipulated the law to provide her 4th husband with Mexican citizenship so he wouldn't be ousted or deported from the state. On the other hand, Juliana married at 15 and remarried 4 times over her life. She had a dozen children, and she left her last husband at the age of 44. She lived the rest of her life with one of her daughters, first with Luciana and then later with Isabel. So that in her 90 years, she never lived alone. She went from her father to her husbands, each successfully, and then finally to her daughters. Her story reflects how complex this was in the mid-19th century. She had rights that she was exercising under the law, and she also had some cultural norms of perception that she was better protected to be in a marriage. This is just a very, very small part of Juliana's story, and it is a fascinating story to see this woman who was part of our California heritage. I'd like to end there and introduce our next speakers. We are extremely, privileged tonight to have 2 award-winning journalists, Susie and Steve Swat, speak this evening on their new book, Paving the Way. Susie spent almost 40 years in leadership positions with the California legislature. She has been on the board, the advisory board for the Institute of Government Studies at UC Berkeley, and she is currently on the board of Friends of the State Archives. She is a ProPublica Award winner for her investigative reporting. Steve is a veteran political analyst and an adjunct professor at Cal State Sacramento. Steve spent over 30 years producing award-winning articles for the San Francisco Examiner, the Los Angeles United Press International, and our own KCRA TV, where he spoke with great aplomb on political events of the time and public policy. And so without further ado, I'd like to present our main speakers tonight, Susie and Steve Swat.
Shelley, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Congratulations to the League of Women Voters for 100 years of great service. And again, it's a pleasure for us to be here. And this is Susie, in case you didn't know. And we're going to tag team this tonight. And so I'm going to get, and we do have a slide presentation, so I'm going to get into that right now. So in the way of an opening, a couple of years ago, Susie and I co-wrote with two other former journalists a book titled Game Changers, 12 Elections That Transformed California. And it was all about men. As Shelley said, men write the history, right? And this was about Leland Stanford and the LA water czar, William Mulholland, who stole all the water from Owens Valley to ship it down south to LA. There were, Hiram Johnson and Pat Brown and Earl Warren and Howard Jarvis, other men, as it turns out, who influenced or were part of elections that had the greatest impact in California. And so we wondered, where were the women? And so we turned first to some of our history books, including some history books we both had as students at Berkeley. And there's like nothing in those history books about the long struggle for equality for women. And so we decided to rectify that. And we decided to find these women who were lost to history, do the research, and bring them to life and tell their stories. And the California women's movement, really from the gold rush to the present, is a story of grit and determination and resilience in the face of discrimination and cultural stereotypes. And the exhaustive fight for suffrage here in California is a great example and a great place to start. So women's suffrage Women's suffrage in the US had been on the public's radar since 1848. That was the year gold was discovered in El Dorado County. And that's when a group of women's activists met in Seneca Falls, New York, and denounced what they call the grievous bondage of women. And in 1878, it was a Northern Californian, US Senator Aaron Sargent of Nevada City, who first introduced those 29 words that later would become the 19th Amendment. Now, there might have been some pillow talk at work here. The senator's wife, Ellen Clark Sargent, was a leading voting rights advocate and a close friend of suffragist Susan B. Anthony. Now, while Congress dawdled for decades, California women pressured state lawmakers for action. In 1896, a ballot measure to give women the vote was placed on a statewide ballot by the legislature. Famed suffragist Susan B. Anthony, in her mid-70s, ran the campaign in Northern California, often giving up to 3 speeches a day. And according to the Napa Journal, she once gave a 1-hour talk to 300 veterans at the Yountville Veterans Home. She was in her 70s at that time. In addition, there were a number of suffrage conventions that drew standing room only attendance and featured another famous national suffragist, Anna Shaw. The women predicted a big victory at the polls, but the measure lost, statewide and in Napa County, by the way. At the Veterans Home, however, out of 273 votes, suffrage won by a 2-to-1 margin. The suffragists hadn't figured that the liquor industry really would do them in, and that's exactly what happened. Women had been closely identified with the temperance movement, and the liquor industry feared women voters would enact prohibition measures throughout the state. The industry was extremely powerful in the largest cities such as San Francisco and Oakland. The wine industry feared prohibition as well, and liquor interests mobilized a last-minute sneak attack, sending flyers to every bar, restaurant, liquor store, and boarding house, warning customers that their next beer could be their last. And the tactic worked. In immigrant communities, especially where liquor was a cultural staple, the men turned on the women. In San Francisco, for example, the vote against suffrage in 1896 was 3-to-1. In fact, all 9 Bay Area counties voted against the suffrage measure. Now, there were many villains during the long suffrage battle, but none as nefarious as James Gillette. At the 1906 Republican Convention in Santa Cruz, Gillette struck up a conversation with leading suffragists and told her that he was a candidate for the party's nomination for governor. And he said he believed in their cause and promised that should he win the nomination and then the election, they, the women, would have a friend in the governor's office. And Gillette did win. But when the suffragist, San Francisco's Lillian Coffin, asked him to fulfill his pledge, he replied, quote, "I was only joshing you. I didn't mean what I said." And besides, he continued, women belonged at home taking care of the kids. Ridiculed, ignored, and deceived, women tried a new tack: civic improvement. They couldn't vote, but they convinced presidents and governors and legislators in California to save large swaths of ancient redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains, the North Coast, and the Sierra foothills. They investigated milk in Southern California that put infants at risk and discovered that many dairy cows had tuberculosis. Their work led to greater government oversight. And in the Bay Area, after the 1906 earthquake, women worked closely with health officials to rid the cities, Oakland and San Francisco, of an infestation of rats that carried bubonic plague. Shortly after that, suffragists made a strategic decision to hitch their wagon to Hiram Johnson and the Progressives, who had split off from the main Republican Party. They and the Progressives found common cause in pushing the idea of political reform. Their message: if men had made such a mess of politics, why not sweep them out of office and give women a try? In 1910, the Progressives, now in power, placed a suffrage measure on a statewide special election ballot in 1911. Now, leading suffragist Selina Solomons of San Francisco understood that to be successful, the campaign had to expand beyond the socially elite and overcome the class divisions that were prevalent in 1896. Minority women were still excluded from the official campaign, but white working class women, shop girls, clerks, and secretaries were brought into the movement. Solomons created what she called the Votes for Women Club in a loft on Sutter Street in San Francisco. She invited working women to come in for an affordable lunch. An entree or a salad cost 5 cents, the equivalent of about $1.35 today. Once there, the women listened to lectures and were given campaign materials to take back to their neighborhoods so they could lobby their brothers, their fathers, and their boyfriends. The women also devised unusual publicity stunts to boost visibility. And one of their biggest problems was trying to attract the men, the voters, to their suffrage speeches. And that's when they had a brainstorm, and this is one of my favorite stories. They enlisted the aid of a spiffy 1910 Packard touring car as a man magnet. The car was quite the attraction. It was a convertible. It sat 7 people. It was the fanciest car on the road. New, it cost $4,000. That was the equivalent of 7 or 8 times the average Californian's yearly salary back then. They called it the Blue Liner. And what they would do is they would park it on a busy street corner and employ a bugler who then would toot the horn and attract attention. Then the women would wait for the male pedestrians to stop by, kick the tires, look under the hood, admire the upholstery, and generally see what the fuss was all about. And once a large crowd gathered, the women would pop up and deliver a pro-suffrage speech. One newspaper reported that at 3 separate stops in San Francisco, the car and the women attracted more than 1,000 voters and a lot of reporters. The LA Times and its blustery publisher Harrison Gray Otis led the campaign against suffrage. Women, he said, should not be burdened by the duty and responsibility of voting. 9 days before the election, the Times printed an article by State Senator J.B. Sanford of Ukiah. In near hysterics, he argued that women's suffrage was a disease that caused divorces and crime. He said it was only supported by, quote, mannish female politicians, sissy men, and women who wished they had been born men. Susan B. Anthony once said of Sanford, quote, as his species would soon be extinct, she would advise him be canned for the benefit of posterity. The campaign went everywhere. One society woman left her home in Madera to ride horseback through the hills and mountains, giving small talks, many of them without dismounting. And the message was clear. Women pay taxes to support the government. Women obey the laws. Thus, they should have something to say as to their making. Most California newspapers supported the suffrage amendment. In the Sacramento Bee, in this cartoon, a man is sitting at his desk thinking, why shouldn't my mother vote? 3 days before the election, a large meeting at the Napa Opera House featured a San Francisco clergyman who argued that women are temperamentally different than men, but they live under the same law and should be permitted to vote. On election day, women kept a watchful eye on the voting. At one polling place in San Francisco, a man said he was voting for suffrage, based on the same theory he would use as if he were having a bad tooth pulled. Quote, it had to be done sometimes, he said, so you might as well get it over with. Now, Selena Solomons wrote the only comprehensive account of the campaign, and she told of the total despair election night, as the first returns, mostly from San Francisco, the largest city in the state, indicated that suffrage was losing by a large margin. As a matter of fact, the day after the election, the Napa Journal was among most newspapers that declared the suffrage measure defeated. The article noted that not all the votes had been counted, especially outside the big cities, but there was no hope, the paper indicated, that the vote would change. And dispirited campaign leaders plotted strategy for the next suffrage attempt. And then something totally unexpected happened. Late, uncounted votes started trickling in from small towns, from farmers and ranchers and miners in the cow counties, and they were breaking heavily for suffrage. This time, the wine-growing counties of Napa and Sonoma supported the women, despite the scare tactics of the liquor industry. 2 days after the election, the voting rights measure narrowly pulled ahead and stayed that way, eventually winning by a scant 3,500 votes, equal to about 1 vote per precinct. The Napa Journal and other newspapers had to scramble to change their headlines. And this time, this came, by the way, from a late edition at 11:30 at night. The Napa and Sonoma counties supported the measure. And get this, Southern California, home of the rabidly anti-suffrage LA Times, put the measure over the top. California thus became the 6th and the largest state to enact women's suffrage. Now, all along, opponents argued that women didn't really want the vote. But the first major test of voter enthusiasm was a couple months later when Los Angeles held municipal elections. In LA, 70,000 women waited in long lines to register to vote, and 65,000 of them cast ballots, a much higher percentage than the men. And as for prohibition, women voters did shut down the bars in a series of special elections in Palo Alto, Los Gatos, Sunnyvale, and Mountain View, but elsewhere, they helped defeat prohibition measures. Women, it turned out, were discerning voters who took their responsibilities seriously. Triumphant California suffragists then went on the road to other states offering advice on how to win the vote. And within 7 years, 9 states, including the powerhouses, Michigan and New York, approved women's suffrage, providing further impetus to those seeking an all-encompassing national voting rights amendment. Still, though, Congress balked, but California was moving forward. In 1918, the first 4 women were elected to the state assembly after trouncing male candidates, and all of them had major accomplishments to their credit, from delivering water to the farms in San Joaquin Valley to enacting criminal justice reform, consumer protection, and minimum wage protection for women in the workplace. 2 of the women had Bay Area ties. Esto Broughton of Modesto nearly died as a youngster when she contracted spinal tuberculosis. It stunted her growth at 4 feet 6 inches and left her handicapped. She went on to school, though, at Cal, was on a champion women's crew, and she graduated with honors from the university's jurisprudence program, even though the dean argued that women were too emotional to become lawyers. At the age of 28, she was elected to the state assembly and became its expert on water and irrigation districts. Anna Saylor lived in Berkeley, and after a fact-finding visit to San Quentin, she devoted her energies to criminal justice reform, such as separating women from men in prison, preventing boys as young as 8 years old from being housed in jails with hardened criminals, abolishing the death penalty for minors, and offering inmates psychiatric help. In the mid-1920s, as Director of Social Welfare, Anna Saylor became the first woman to serve in a governor's cabinet. Now Susie will bring us more up to date and take us home.
For 4 months after those first 4 women were elected to office, an Illinois congressman introduced the same suffrage measure that Aaron Sargent had sponsored 40 years earlier. This time it passed and was sent to the state legislatures for ratification. Now, to become law, the amendment needed 36 legislatures to agree, but it was stuck on 35. It all came down to Tennessee, but the southern states were adamantly opposed to the amendment, so the outlook looked bleak. The Tennessee Senate voted for suffrage, but the House was tied at 48 to 48 when 24-year-old Harry Byrne stood to cast the deciding vote. He already had indicated he would vote no. However, just before the vote, he was handed a letter. It was from the most influential person in his life, his mother. "Do the right thing," the letter said. "Vote for suffrage and don't keep them in doubt." Byrne did exactly what his mother told him to do. He put the letter in his coat pocket and cast the deciding vote for suffrage. Harry put it this way: "I knew that a mother's advice is always the safest for a boy to follow. I appreciated the fact that an opportunity to free 17 million women from political slavery was mine." Meantime, the women's movement had taken a new turn. Activists were looking beyond the 72-year struggle for suffrage to the day women would have responsibility of shaping public policy. Thus, at its annual convention in 1920, the National American Women Suffrage Association reinvented itself as the League of Women Voters. Its first imperative was to convince women to take advantage of the new political power they fought so hard to achieve. Another imperative was that the League would be in the forefront of social and government reform, but would be nonpartisan. In the 1920s, the League sponsored its first Get Out the Vote campaign. Now, after that breakthrough California election in 1918, in which the first 4 women were elected to the state assembly, only 10 other women would win assembly seats in the ensuing 56 years. Now, there were a variety of reasons for that. During the Depression, for example, it was expected that men, as the head of the household, deserved jobs before women, in politics or in the general workplace. During World War II, women who wanted to work were expected to serve the war effort in defense factories, not run for political office. In fact, for 10 years, starting in 1942, Catherine Niehaus was the only female in the legislature. In the 50s and 60s, women were expected to stay at home with the kids and take advantage of new household conveniences. Still, women outside government continued to find ways to make a difference. Now, a prime example of that is right here in Northern California. In 1961, 3 women were shocked to read a story in the Oakland Tribune that predicted dire consequences for San Francisco Bay if plans for development continued, specifically the filling of more than 2,000 acres in Berkeley. All 3 had connections to UC Berkeley. Esther Gerlich was married to a professor, Catherine Kerr was the wife of UC President Clark Kerr, and Sylvia McLaughlin's husband was a UC regent. Now, the women built a large coalition and successfully lobbied the state to place a moratorium on filling the bay, as well as a commission to watch over shoreland development. They inspired other California women outside of government to work at improving our quality of life. The women's movement received a huge boost in 1960 with the government's approval of the birth control pill. That innovation allowed women to postpone childbearing while offering them opportunities to attend college and enter the workforce. 1966 was a breakthrough year. March Fong, a member of the Oakland League of Women Voters, became the first Asian American woman to be elected to the legislature. Now, as you can see here from the photo, she also smashed a toilet on the steps of the Capitol to push her bill banning paid toilets in state buildings. That was many, many years ago, but back then, in many public spaces, women had to carry around dimes to unlock public toilet stalls. March Vong Yu went on to become California's first female Secretary of State. Also in 1966, another barrier was broken as Yvonne Brathwaite became the first African-American woman elected to the legislature. She went on to Congress, then enjoyed a long career as a Los Angeles County supervisor. Now, in our research, we came across a very interesting article in the San Francisco Examiner. There was a headline that called these two new assemblywomen, and I quote here, beautiful and brainy. The article didn't deal with their qualifications or platforms. Instead, it emphasized their hairdos and fashion choices, and it ran in the women's section of the newspaper. Now, in our research, we didn't happen to find any stories that referred to bald male legislators and their taste in business suits. In the mid-1970s, two other barriers were smashed. In 1974, Janet Gray Hayes was elected the first woman mayor in San Jose's 197-year history. She also was the first woman to lead a US city with a population of 500,000 or greater. Hayes was an ardent environmentalist who was a leader in the San Jose and Bay Area League of Women Voters. 126 years after statehood, in 1976, Californians elected their first woman state senator, Roseanne Vuitch. Now, when a male member would stand on the Senate floor and out of habit referred to gentlemen of the Senate, she would ring a small porcelain bell that she kept on her desk to remind the senators of her presence. The Senate was so unprepared for her arrival, it didn't even have a women's restroom near the Senate floor. Today, there's a rose room dedicated in her honor. The 1960s brought more women running for office. 90s. And for the first time in the 140-year history of our state, a woman was selected as a major party nominee for governor. Now, while San Francisco's Dianne Feinstein did not win in 1990, she and Barbara Boxer of Marin County both won Senate seats in 1992, making California the first state to be represented by two females simultaneously in the US Senate. Also that year, thanks to term limits and redistricting, California women picked up a record 6 seats in the legislature and 4 seats in the US House of Representatives. In the 2018 elections, many women, of course, were motivated by the Me Too movement that began in California and concerns that the Trump administration and the courts might reverse some of the public policy gains they had won over the years, from reproductive rights to equality in the workplace. Now, for the first time in history, California has 3 female statewide constitutional officers serving simultaneously, all Bay Area daughters of immigrants. Eleni Kounalakis is the state's first woman lieutenant governor. Betty Yee is state controller, and Fiona Ma is treasurer. But California remains only one of 20 states that has never elected a female governor, although 3 women have received major party nominations since 1990. Women now comprise nearly 1/3 of the legislature, with a record 38 members in the combined Assembly and Senate. And it's more racially diverse than ever before, better reflecting the state's demographics. And the Senate leader, Toni Atkins, not only is the first woman to head the upper house, she's also the first to come from California's LGBTQ community. She previously was Speaker of the Assembly. Now, there are many reasons why women need to become key players in the development of public policy. Studies show that women are more prone than men to seek consensus on contentious matters, and consensus leads to problem solving. Further, women bring a different perspective to issues, and often they take up matters that men seem to ignore. And when I started in the legislature, there were only 3 women lawmakers. Today, 3 of the 4 legislative leaders are women. With the gradual increase in female representation beginning in the 70s and the 80s, came more women staffers and consultants, more women lobbyists, more female Capitol reporters, and more attention to issues we care about. Further, and I speak from firsthand experience, there's finally a workable process to deal with the rampant sexual harassment. Women pioneers and activists have been battling the odds and taking political risks for 170 years now, and they've been making a difference, paving the way, if you will, since statehood, becoming role models for future generations of leaders. Now, we have really enjoyed putting this presentation together, and we learned a lot about Napa County in the process. And for those of you who would like additional fascinating and untold stories of some of California's trailblazing women, we have a special promotion for our friends in Napa. Please contact us at the email on your screen, swat@comcast.net, and we'll be glad to make arrangements to get books to you. Thank you. We're willing to take any questions. Yeah.
There you go.
Yes, thank you very much, Steve and Susie Swat. This is such an interesting book. I've had such fun reading it over the last few months. And, you know, I really want to thank you for offering the discount and sending it for free and mailing it to our community. So if this is something that interests you, I highly recommend that you check it out, check out their website as well. And I'm so happy that you mentioned information about our women leaders from the Asian American Pacific Islander community, since this is the May is the month for honoring Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So thank you very much. So as the questions start to come in, I did want to remind you all that the Historical Society has this very interesting book, and it's called A Rumbling of Women, Napa Feminists from 1970 to 1990. So this is also a nice piece of research information resource for you. And while we're waiting for questions, we only have a couple minutes. I'm wondering if the SWATs can tell us how, where they found their information to write the.
Yeah. You want to start?
Well, one of my responsibilities was looking at all of the election results, statewide election results, both the primary and the general election, starting in 1910. So I looked through well over 100 statement of votes to look at women's names, who had run, what happened to the women, and then we would look them up individually in very interesting races. And we found most of our information we used was in newspapers, because as Steve mentioned earlier, a lot of these women were never in the history books.
Yeah, you can't find most of these women at all. And so what we would do is we would find some great stories in newspapers.
Yeah.
And also, you know, sometimes we would find a master's thesis or a PhD thesis, and we would follow the footnotes. And a lot of times they would footnote a newspaper article or something else, and then we would go to that. We consulted the oral history program at the Bancroft Library in Berkeley, and the state library, state archives has an oral history program, which is great. They've done a lot of interviews with some of the major players involved in public policy and politics in California, going back many, many decades. We went down to Berkeley and did a lot of research at the Bancroft Library, which is a wealth of information. But it was fascinating because so many of the stories and the color, and our book is primarily about storytelling, fitting that into a historical narrative. But so much of this color was found in the newspapers, but not in the history books at all. And so we found that to be very, very enlightening.
Very interesting. Here's one comment. So someone from our audience wonders if you found any information about Ellen Button of Petaluma, her great aunt. So apparently she was involved in the suffrage movement. Was that anything that stood out for you?
It doesn't stand out to us, but there were so many people involved in the suffrage movement in California, both in 1896 and through 1911. And we found, a number of them, but we were careful. We didn't want to make this book an encyclopedia. We wanted to tell stories. We wanted it to be really interesting. So we stayed away from just listing names like so many history books might do, and went in the opposite direction and fit them into a historical narrative, but told their stories and their backstories. If I can give one other story, just comes to mind, and it's apropos because of what we're going through now. But in 1918, that's when the first 4 women were elected to the state legislature. But another woman by the name of Dr. Mabel Anthony from Oakland, she ran for the state senate. She wanted to become the very first woman state senator. She did not win that election, but right after the election, her sister in a small town in Arizona became ill from the Spanish flu. And she rushed out there to tend to her. And once she helped her sister get better, she stayed in Arizona to help the health officials deal with the pandemic. And then she came back to California, and she gets back to Oakland, not realizing that she had caught it, this virus, when she was in Arizona. And then she was deathly ill. Her sister, hearing about this, now recovered, rushes by train from Arizona to California to get to Oakland before she dies. There is a train pileup and derailment in Needles. And so her train coming into Oakland was delayed by several hours, and she missed seeing her sister alive by a couple of hours. I mean, that's just one of those amazing stories that sort of fits with what we're going through today.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that little tidbit of information. It's so interesting. So one of the other questions that we have is, how long did it take you to write the book? And were there so many stories that you had to pare it down once you got going on the research?
Well, yes, it took us a few years. I mean, let's see, our other book, Game Changers, came out in 2015, and we spent 2015 and much of 2016 on the road doing presentations. And right after that is when we started working on this book. And it was the research that took a lot of time. And because we were, again, going through all these old newspapers at the state library and state archives and various collections and things like that. And so it took us 2.5 years, I think, from beginning to end.
And Steve and Susie, if you could give a shout out to Justin Hole. He lives in Napa and is in the Kiwanis Club and just wants to say hi.
Hi, Justin.
Hi, Justin. Hi.
There you go. That's good. And then lastly, before we take a break here, is do you know if more women in California vote than men? What have you found in your research?
Yes.
Yeah, in many instances, yes.
Yeah, they do, and more women than ever before are running for office right
Yes.
now. And Susie's kept up with all of that, but women are much more reliable voters, and which goes back to that argument in 1911 and again in 1896 that women really don't want the vote. One of the arguments was, well, women shouldn't be sullied by the dark arts of politics. That's not where they belong. Well, let the women decide if they want to get involved in that or not. But yes, women are much more faithful voters than men.
And the other thing is women are doing some very smart things by running for local office first, and then to run for state offices, to the Assembly, to the Senate, and also to Congress. So a lot more women are running on the local level.
That's very interesting. And a lot of
Including
women.
Diane Dillon, who's on this call, right?
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of women join the League of Women Voters to get their feet wet in the political system.
Well, that is so important. That's so important because I think we've learned, for the most part, you can't just jump in and run for governor. I mean, Meg Whitman tried that and lost $144 million of her kids' inheritance. So, starting at the beginning, learning the ropes about politics, building up endorsements, building up community support, it all counts.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to give control back over to the Historical Society.
I want to thank our guests. Incredible presentations from all three of you. Fascinating, inspiring. I'm just honestly just proud to be a woman in this day and age. Two, it's very exciting. County Supervisor Diane Dillon, she's been representing the women in elected office for a long time, and she's the chair of our Board of Supervisors here in Napa County. She's also a local historian with deep family roots in the Napa County. And so she's also one of those trailblazers. And so I want to, who's going to be buying this book? Who's going to buy the Paving the Pathway? If you don't have it already, again, I encourage you to get it. And you can get it either as they offered the information before. We'll have this posted again on our website, but I'm certainly going to get it. I'm excited to get it along with your other book, Game Changers, 12 Elections That Transformed California. Thank you, Steve and Susie Swat, for all of this. I have a few announcements I want to share on behalf of the Napa County Historical Society. I didn't introduce myself. For those who don't know, my name is Liz Alessio, and I'm the director for the Napa County Historical Society. And some of you also may know that I was also inspired by in 2018 to run for local office. So I'm also a city councilwoman for the city of Napa. I want to share a couple upcoming events. Our next virtual offering will be this next Wednesday, May 27th from 7 to 8 p.m. This is the third of a three-part series it's a historic tour of the Tule Cemetery. It's titled Mansions of the Dead. Tom Spalding, local historian, photographer, and Napa County Historical Society board president, has put this special tour together. It really highlights the long ago distinguished Napa families from their mansions to these majestic mausoleums. We will continue these YouTube video premieres on Wednesday nights, and we'll have more live events on Friday nights, thanks to the help of Nicole Riggs, our librarian, and Shelley Smith, who did a presentation tonight. We'll continue with these Friday evening special events. And I also want to share, as we wait to reopen the Goodman Library, because we are still closed right now, we are open for research and photo requests. And you can do that by just emailing us at info@napahistory.org or calling our main number, which is 224-1739. And please, if you're not already a member, we hope you'll join us. We are a membership-based organization dedicated to preserving the people and history of Napa County and its place in California history. We wish you and your loved ones on this Memorial Weekend well, and take time. Of course, we'll all be taking time to remember our men and women who have served our country and made the ultimate sacrifice for all of us. So thank you once again, everybody.
Thank you for tuning in today. We hope you enjoyed the programming. Remember, you can social distance while still getting closer to local history.